One of the most memorable passages in the entire Bible can be found in John chapter 8, verses 2 through 11, the pericope adultery, or, in plain English, the woman caught in adultery. It's no wonder why this became a favorite passage of Christians. It has Jesus actually showing some compassion rather than preaching about it, and a woman is the fortunate recipient. Jesus even goes so far as to abrogate the Mosaic law, or in other words, God's law, which proscribed stoning those guilty of adultery. But in this scene, Jesus chooses to ignore the Mosaic law and actually employ forgiveness. Let's forget for a second the contradiction of Jesus encouraging someone to break the Mosaic law, which he himself commanded against in Matthew 5:19. This scene contains the true essence of forgiveness and a truly ingenious rhetorical comeback. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. A reminder that we have all stumbled at one point or another. But did John actually write this account? Let's look briefly at why Ehrman, along with most scholars, believe that it was never part of the original Gospel of John. The story itself raises a few questions. First, where was the man who was also caught with the woman? The law commanded that both the man and woman were to be put to death. Perhaps the man had already been stoned, and bringing the woman to Jesus to trap him between God's law and forgiveness was a mere afterthought. But why would Jesus contradict his own command in Matthew 5:19 about breaking the law and teaching others to do so? If any of Jesus' disciples had been present, is it remotely conceivable that they would not want to know the name of such a recipient of grace as that woman? Yet, like a fictional parable, the woman goes unnamed, as do the Pharisees throughout all four Gospels. But there are stronger reasons to dismiss the account as being original to John. One of the strongest reasons is that it is missing from the earliest and best manuscripts of the Gospel of John. The widely acclaimed biblical scholar Bruce Metzger, in his 1971 book, had this to say: "The evidence for the non-Johannine origin of the pericope of the adulteress is overwhelming. It is absent from such early and diverse manuscripts as Papyrus 66 and 75, Aleph BLNTWXY DQY 0141 0211 22, etc. Codices A and C are defective in this part of John, but it is highly probable that neither contained the pericope, for careful measurement discloses that there would not have been space enough on the missing leaves to include the section along with the rest of the text. In the East, the passage is absent from the oldest form of the Syriac version, as well as from the Sahidic and the Sub-Akhmimic versions and the older Bohairic manuscripts. Some Armenian manuscripts and the Old Georgian version omit it. In the West, the passage is absent from the Gothic version and from several Old Latin manuscripts. No Greek church father prior to Euthemius Zigabinus, 12th century, comments on the passage, and Euthemius declares that the accurate copies of the Gospels do not contain it. It is missing in the Greek lectionary reading at Pentecost, which runs from John chapter 7, verse 37 to chapter 8, verse 12. The account appears in different locations of John and verbatim in a few manuscripts of Luke's Gospel. Depending on the manuscript, some have it after John 21:25. Some have it after John 7:52, one copy after John 7:36, and some have it after Luke 21:38. The writing style is quite different from the rest of John, including the immediate context in which it exists. Many words and phrases found in the passage are not to be found elsewhere in the Gospel, such as presbyteros, synedeses, and katalepo, all three showing up in just one verse, chapter 8, verse 9. And another huge piece of evidence, the passage is not quoted by any church father until around the time of St. Augustine, a full 370 years after the death of Jesus. A veritable who's who of church fathers from all over the Mediterranean and abroad for almost 4 centuries remain silent on this passage, while quoting freely and even providing a verse-by-verse commentary on many passages from the Gospel of John, including the surrounding verses of the passage in question. But just because none of the church fathers even mentioned this passage doesn't mean they weren't aware of it, right? Though the mere silence of ecclesiastical writers is no proof that they were unacquainted with a particular section, yet that silence becomes significant when they wrote expressly on the subject to which it relates, and when they wrote in such a way as to show that they could hardly by possibility have been acquainted with it. So too with regard to such ecclesiastical writers as wrote commentaries. Thus it may be held for certain that Tertullian and Cyprian knew nothing of the passage, while Origen and Chrysostom show in their commentaries that they were not aware of its existence. It has been indeed objected that nothing is proved by Origen's silence, because he often passes by portions of St. John's Gospel, and he had no occasion to mention this narrative. But in reading his commentary on this part of the Gospel, it is difficult, if not impossible, to imagine that he knew of anything between chapter 7 verse 52 and chapter 8 verse 12, for he cites and comments on every verse from chapter 7:40 to 52, and then at once continues from chapter 8 verse 12 in the same manner. It's easy to understand why Origen's commentary would skip the 12 verses in question. His copy of John did not contain them. Once the 4th century arrives, it would seem that no church father could keep from quoting the passage. The clear implication is that the passage was written and inserted into the Gospel sometime during the 4th century. But what about the scholars who actually translated the various Bible versions? Wouldn't they have known of this problem passage? Yes. That the story of the adulteress is not genuine to the original Gospel of John is also noted in the footnotes of many Bible translations, such as the following. That the passage was not part of the original Gospel is simply not in dispute.